Hi everybody, welcome back. We've got another session for you now on the Professional Learning Portfolio, the PLP. And we're going to take a deeper dive in this session and introduce you to 5 videos that look at various aspects of using the PLP to support your progress towards the QTS standards. So we're going to be looking at how we use the PLP in tandem with assessment.
Now, this is a set of resources you're going to want to revisit during your time on the programme, probably each time you come to a progress review point or are preparing for it. You'll also be well advised to make sure that your mentor and any other interested school colleagues out on placement are aware of this resource, either in its full session form like this, or the 5 videos are also available separately.
The first of the 5 videos looks at the sorts of evidence that you're going to gather to demonstrate that you're making progress. So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what types of evidence you're going to be curating, pulling together, and how that's going to reflect the different stages in your development, in your progress. Hello everybody, it's Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze here from the Clinical Practice Workstream. We have put together for you a suite of videos to guide you in how to use the PLP, the Professional Learning Portfolio, to support your progress towards QTS and beyond. In this first of our suite of videos, we're going to talk to you about why an e-portfolio is so crucial for teacher trainees. And then we're going to move on to identify the types of evidence that you will put together in your portfolio and what your evidence will look like at milestones on the continuum of effective practice from unaware to capable and QTS plus and beyond. So beginning with why an e-portfolio might be useful to you, kind of from a broad philosophical perspective as a teacher trainee. Well, we've looked to the world of research and evidence-based practice to give us some kind of key headlines in support of our approach here. And I'm quoting our lovely Tom Breeze here, who is quoting Paulson and Mayer when he says, the PLP is not intended as a showcase of your best work. And I guess we can't really emphasize that enough. We'll come back to that in a moment. What the PLP is intended is as a window into your head, a means for both staff and student teachers to understand the educational process at the level of the individual learner. And then Tom goes on to say, and that means we should be able to see you evolve as a teacher over the course of the year. So I guess right up front, what we want to say to you is, particularly for your first progress review, your portfolio initially may feel to you like something that you don't necessarily want to share, because it might feel a bit like you're showcasing the fact that you're not quite the finished article. But that's the whole point. What you will be able to do over the course of this year is to look back on previous evidence that you used for earlier progress reviews, and hopefully you'll be able to see how far you've come.
And as we'll see later on when we're talking about the progress review, we've built into this portfolio a process by which you can take stock of where you are, look at your best bits of evidence, maybe get rid of the ones you're not so happy with from earlier on. And so there'll almost be kind of 2 halves to the portfolio. There will be all the things that you've gathered on your journey towards qualifying as a teacher, and then there'll be the bits that you choose to highlight to the people who are assessing you. So it's really important that thinking about it from a maths point of view, you show you're working.
Absolutely. Another thing you might be asking, well, why does this need to be digital? What's the benefit of being an e-portfolio as opposed to, a paper-based portfolio that we used to use in previous iterations of the programme? Well, we look to a research article by Oakley, Pegram and Johnson here, who give us some good justifications. They talk about the variety of evidence that can be showcased in an e-portfolio that simply can't be achieved with just static paper-based versions. So we can upload, or you can upload, videos, visuals, etc., that kind of give us a much clearer view of your progress, because obviously we're working in very dynamic environments that we can't really capture very easily purely through text. They talk about your ability to use one piece of evidence for more than one purpose, and we've definitely got that going on. And when we talk to you in a later video about how you tag your evidence, you'll notice that actually you can be potentially a lot more efficient and economical when gathering your evidence, because you'll notice that one piece might serve many purposes in terms of showcasing your progress towards the QTS standards. Digitally, it's actually a lot more easily organised. It may not feel that way yet when you're starting your journey, but once you get into some good kind of protocols and you apply the conventions that we've set up around tagging, then you'll find it a lot easier to organise your portfolio digitally. You'll have the ability to cross-reference evidence. I've talked about this a moment ago, using one piece for multiple standards. You'll have the ability to structure and restructure to reflect your changing conceptions of what's important. And that comes directly from this article. And it really does link and back up with what Tom just mentioned. You might decide later on in the year that actually a piece of evidence that you had for one of the pedagogy standards actually isn't your best evidence anymore. You've got something that is far more sufficient of demonstrating where you're at that moment in time. And finally, what it can do down the line is facilitate educational networking. And you're probably noticing this because already you've got several people who are able to see your portfolio and are potentially able to learn from what you've said too. And then later on in your career, it might continue to follow you and continue to be a useful artifact to share with other colleagues, to show them how you've problem solved an aspect of your practice.
So what I want to do first is to take what is probably a big pile of things in your e-portfolio, or will shortly be a big pile of things if you need to do some uploading. And we really need to give you a guide to thinking your way around this disparate pile of evidence, to make sense of it, to organise it into categories, and then to make some sort of judgment yourself, because the progress review starts with self-assessment, about where that evidence sits on the continuum of effectiveness from unaware to hopefully potentially QTS plus.
Great. Okay, so starting out with types of evidence that Tom just mentioned, what we've done is we've grouped together the different types of evidence that you may have and just given them 3 big juicy titles, and we'll tell you what each of those big juicy titles entails on a granular level. So our first big broad area of evidence is evidence of practice, and what's encompassed in this broad area is your learning and teaching plans and evaluations, which you use the tag lesson plan for. Your minutes of meetings, so any mentor meetings that you might have, or indeed any other meetings with colleagues that you might have that are going to be useful as evidence of your progress and actually are useful for you anyway to kind of log the key points that were discussed. And you'll be tagging those particular sources of evidence as mentor meeting. Regardless of who they were with, that's the tag that they will have. And also, under the broad heading of evidence of practice, you will have evidence of the impact on pupil progress. Now, this is an important one, and at the moment, it doesn't really have a very logical tag, so we're going to tell you how you might do this. As you will probably have started to notice, is that the work in your pupils' books, or indeed if you're a practical subject, other evidence of pupil progress, maybe videos, maybe pictures of what they're doing, annotated, are really useful in demonstrating that the teaching that you've done has had an impact on pupil progress. So the evidence of impact on pupil progress is going to be a really important piece of evidence or pool of evidence to show how your practice is developing. So what we've decided for you is that it'd be useful to tag those types of evidence as lesson plan as well. And to make it logical and easy for you to organise, if you've tagged a series of evidence of pupil progress, let's say a series of book work associated with a year 7 sequence of lessons, let's call them hypothetically 7A, any book work that you tag as lesson plan, you're then going to give it a really logical name that links to 7A's sequence of lessons. So for example, 7A lesson 1, pupil A's work.
And then the next broad category we've got is evidence of assessment. And it's quite important at the outset to say that we're not talking about you assessing the pupils here. That's the impact stuff that you're putting under evidence of practice. This is evidence of assessment of you.
Yes. Now, there are 3 different kind of subtypes of evidence that come under evidence of assessment. And the first one is progress reviews and learning and teaching observations. Now, there's a specific place for you to upload these particular documents on the PLP, and it is the assessment tab. And in this assessment tab, you'll notice that you've got subheadings and areas where you can upload learning and teaching observation forms, progress review forms, and, if applicable, concern over progress, but we won't focus on that too much for now. Now, the only thing that's missing here that doesn't have a place in this area is evidence in your formative comments logbook. Now, that's the blue book that your mentor writes in, or indeed other colleagues in the department write in whenever you're teaching lessons that aren't formally assessed. Now, this one's a slightly trickier one, but the way to think about this is you're only really going to tag this if it's a really great example of something that you're doing that shows that you're meeting one or several of the standards. So if you've got pages from your formative comments logbook that you think meet that brief or meet those criteria, then you're going to tag them to one or multiple standards. So let's say, for example, I've got an entry in my formative comments logbook that is about differentiation. Then I'm definitely going to tag that as P2. So I'm going to upload it to my assets and I'm going to tag it with P2. I might find that it also meets some other of the P standards, the pedagogy standards, a bit later on, but that's okay for now. I'm just going to tag it as P2 and I might come back to it when I'm prepping for my progress review. So that's the 3 different types of evidence under evidence of assessment. So we've had evidence of practice, evidence of assessment, and finally we've got the final big subcategory, and that's evidence of research and inquiry. And everything under this final broad headline will be tagged with reflection. They'll all be slightly different in type. So, for example, you will use reflective models for various different purposes, such as reflecting on lesson observations that you've had, such as reflecting on aspects of your practice that you're trying to develop. You will also have activities that you've completed as part of school-led training days that you will have uploaded to your assets and tagged with reflection that will be stored in this area too, and will fall under this broad heading. And then finally, you might also have subject or phase directed study tasks that you again will upload to your asset store and tag with reflection. So all of those types of evidence tagged as reflection come under a broader heading of evidence of research and inquiry.
So once you've got your head around these different categories of evidence, the next question is trying to understand where you are on the continuum of effective practice that we've set out in the Assessment of Student Teachers Guide. In previous years, we've tended to take the view that we need to define every single standard at every single level, and it's resulted in an enormous document that's been really quite hard work to deal with. What we've done on this new version of the programme is give samples of the sort of language that would apply at each different level. So that table is extremely useful for students and for mentors and senior mentors when trying to make decisions about where they feel they are. However, it's slightly more complicated than that because, as you can see, on this version of the programme, you've got a lot of different sorts of evidence that come from a lot of different sources, and the professional teaching standards are designed in such a way that they don't sit in isolation, they interact with one another. And so what we thought would be useful would be to give you some idea, some kind of visualisation of what your evidence will look like in an area and how it will interact or not, depending on where you are. And then you can take an area of the professional teaching standards, gather together your evidence using the PLP's search function, which we'll show you later, and come to a view about what kind of stage of that process your evidence library resembles.
Yes, and of course, again, we can justify this by looking to the literature and again looking at Oakley, Pegram and Johnston, who say it's crucial that pre-service teachers or teacher trainees are able to make links between prior and new knowledge, between different academic units of work and between university-based and professional practice-based learning. E-portfolios, it has been suggested, are ideal for promoting this kind of integrated thinking. So To start off with then, we're going to look at unaware, and we're going to begin by looking at some of those descriptors in the table on the continuum of effective practice that Tom mentioned, which is also available in the Assessment of Teachers on Clinical Practice Guide. So at the unaware stage, what we've done is we've kind of pulled out some of the key words that might be useful in describing what your evidence is like. So you've got a long list there, but we've just pulled out some of the ones that might be important in relation to evidence. So evidence at the unaware stage might be limited, perhaps not yet considered, erratic, underdeveloped, superficial, poor quality, and unsuitable. And then when you're presenting that evidence and justifying it at progress review, it might demonstrate zero impact on learning, or indeed your progress. And you might also be lacking in confidence when you're trying to justify the evidence that you've included. So those words are really useful in describing A, the evidence, and B, your approach during progress reviews. So if you think about that in real terms then, about what that kind of looks like on someone's PLP at the unaware stage, we might describe those different streams or those different broad areas of evidence as being quite disconnected, quite disparate, quite granular. So you might have done a little bit of research and inquiry. You might have done, a few lesson plans. You might have some evidence informative comments, logbooks, and perhaps one learning and teaching observation. But at this stage, there's no real sense of how they're connected and how one is impacting on the other. So, for example, how the lesson that you planned links with the feedback that you received, and indeed then the next steps that you took in trying to move yourself from an unaware stage to an aware stage. So the key word to describe the look of the evidence on your PLP at this stage is disconnected.
And one of the things we do keep going on about is the significantly larger amount of time that student teachers have got for research and inquiry while they're on their clinical practice placements. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's good news if the student teacher is just visibly doing stuff all of the time, going out, observing, reading, writing things down. What we're looking at here is some thinking, some deep thinking about the way things interact, because it would be very easy to collect an enormous amount of stuff related to a standard or an area of practice. But where the real magic starts to happen and where the awareness starts to come, so by definition, when we start moving to the next stage, it's when the student teacher has sat down and explicitly done some deep thinking in order to see where these things connect and where they interact.
Absolutely. And we can see that borne out in the descriptors at the aware stage. I'm going back now to the tables of descriptors. I'm looking at aware. We're in the orange column, and we can see words like developing, growing. We also see words like inconsistent, which is useful. We can see introduced, fairly superficial. We can see improving, and we can see suitable. So bearing in mind what Tom said there about allowing the time and space to you, the student teacher, and anybody supporting that student teacher, it's about encouraging those links to start to emerge. And I guess at progress review stage, the helpful words in the list there is that the student teacher will be able to demonstrate some impact. So we've moved from no impact to some impact, and also developing confidence when they're justifying the evidence used to support their self-assessment judgments. So looking at what the evidence might look like at this stage, we can use words like sequences of evidence to describe it. So we can see that starting to emerge. So connections between lessons planned, evaluated, and reflected on, perhaps in a reflective log entry. We might see the student teacher having received some feedback in a formative comments logbook, having planned several lessons to try and work on a target that's emerged, having reflected a little bit more on what was suggested, and then perhaps in a more formal learning and teaching observation, they've received feedback that they've made progress. So we can see a sequence of cause and effect starting to emerge here, and a sequence of reflection binding together their evidence.
So hopefully you can envisage here that a student teacher is going to be undertaking activities in a purposeful way when they've moved to the aware stage, and also that the bar between unaware and aware is relatively low. We're not asking for the completed article, we're asking for people to be off the ground, but that the one thing you do need to bear in mind is that moving from unaware to aware is going to take an investment of time.
Certainly, absolutely. And certainly to make the jump to capable, where we've then, when we go back to the table of descriptors, we've got words like wide-ranging, mainly established, mainly consistent, mainly embedded, mainly thorough, quality/good quality, and mainly relevant. And then importantly, when we get to how we might describe the justifications, we've got words like mainly impactful and confident. Now, what we envisage these sequences of evidence to start to evolve into at the capable stage is cycles of evidence, almost reflective of an action research cycle where the student teacher is planning, is evaluating, is engaging in professional dialogue and research and inquiry with the mentor, is using evidence of pupil work to demonstrate the impact and to evidence the impact that their pedagogy is having. But what the teacher might also be doing is looking for links within and across standards areas at the capable stage. So, for example, using evidence of collaboration to support the advances in pedagogy, using evidence of professional learning to underpin decisions that were made in learning and teaching plans. So those cycles of evidence bear out this idea that this is a student teacher who is embedding this approach in their practice, who is being thorough, and who is able to confidently demonstrate impact.
And the other thing it bears out, of course, is the fact that a student teacher at the capable stage is at the stage where we would be prepared to sign them off for qualified teacher status. And this is where the cyclic nature of this evidence becomes quite important, because several of the words in the continuum of effective practice make reference to the fact that the student teacher becomes increasingly independent of the mentor. And so what the student teacher needs to be able to do is to move beyond doing something to impact on something else, making one connection and then stopping, to making these connections and then continuing a cycle independently and becoming self-improving.
Absolutely. So we've gone from disconnected, disparate, granular evidence through to sequences emerging and connections, sense of cause and effect at the aware stage, all the way through to the capable stage, where we've got cycles of evidence where the student teacher has moved to a plane where they have become self-improving and more independent in their practice. Which takes us to QTS Plus, where we've got, again, the useful descriptors of firmly established, extensive, consistent, fully embedded, in-depth, high quality, intuitive, which we believe are useful words in characterising evidence that we see at this stage. And then in terms of their progress review, this will be a student teacher who has strong evidence of their impact and also who is demonstrating a sense of innovation in what it is that they're trying to achieve in their pedagogy and in other areas of the standards. So I guess the way we would characterise the evidence here is that the cycles are fully embedded, that there are multiple cycles of evidence that are going on dependent on the particular student teacher's areas of strength and areas for development. Connections, again, being made across standards, are also cyclical in nature and a routine aspect of their professional practice. And there's evidence of impact that is extensive, not only for them, the teacher, but also for pupils across a range of classes, year groups, etc., and might also be starting to impact perhaps more widely on the practice of colleagues within their department.
So we'd be looking here at a student teacher really beginning to get a grip on the way that the new professional teaching standards in Wales interconnect in really complex ways with one another. So while the individual cycles of evidence that we saw at the aware stage might have involved a number of quite complex connections being made between standards, those cycles themselves begin to interconnect once we move beyond that stage, so that we've got, as Emma says, a number of these cyclic processes going on. The student understanding the really complex ways that teaching as a really complicated job interacts with a number of things at the sort of macro and the micro level, and all of it is moving forward, having a really strong impact on pupils and progress, and is probably impacting on the school as a wider community as well.
Absolutely. So what we've done for you there is we've given, hopefully, a strong rationale for why the e-portfolio is going to be important to the student teacher's development and progress towards QTS and beyond. We've given you, hopefully, some clear descriptions of the three main categories of evidence that you will pull together as a student teacher, or as a mentor, you will help your student teacher pull together. We've then given you examples of what that evidence will look like and how it will evolve from the unaware to the QTS plus stage. And your next steps now will be to have a look at an individual standard and some model discussions that we've got in a series of videos that characterise a student teacher's evidence for that particular standard at unaware, aware and capable. Okay, so we've had a look at the types of evidence that you'll be pulling together and uploading to your PLP. Now we're going to go a bit more granular and look at a specific standard and how your evidence might develop and progress to demonstrate your progression in that particular standard.
We've got 3 videos for you now. Fictitious students A, B and C, who are at unaware, aware and capable in standard P2, which is differentiation. And we're going to talk around those fictitious students and what their work looks like.
Hello, it's Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze here from the Clinical Practice Workstream. We're going to be modelling to you some discussions centring on assessment of student teachers whilst on clinical practice. Discussions that might be held around assessment between students and mentors, students and senior mentors, university tutors and mentors and senior mentors during the quality assurance process and progress reviews.
So what we're going to do here is take one of the professional teaching standards, namely P2, differentiation, and we're going to model a discussion between 2 people, could be any of the 2 people Emma's just mentioned, around a fictitious student's progress so far in that standard. And we hope that the principles that we kind of outline here will be transferable to any one of the teaching standards, or if you're looking a bit more holistically, it wouldn't be a huge stretch to apply these principles to a group of standards as well.
We're not intending for this guidance to be subject or phase specific, so we've tried our best to make this guidance and this model discussion as applicable across all of our aspects of our programme as we can. It's worth us flagging up that more information can be accessed as well to complement this guidance in the Assessment of Student Teachers on Clinical Practice Guide, which can be found on the Clinical Practice Moodle site under the Partnership Handbook tile.
And you may be aware that we've moved on from having the old style assessment framework, for those of you that have fond memories of that, where every single standard was defined in quite a complicated descriptor at every single grading level. Because we're trying to look a little bit more holistically, we've got a table with columns with the sort of language you would expect to be using for different standards at different levels. And so if you look at nothing else in the Assessment of Student Teachers book, it would be well worth looking at that table, because that sort of language throughout learning and teaching observations, formative comments in the Blue Book, any kind of written evidence, if we use that language as a way of defining things, it just makes it easier for us to understand, all of us, where we're at and where we need to go.
Okay, so we're going to begin by discussing a student who we feel in Standard Pedagogy 2 differentiation is at the unaware stage in their progress. And just to reiterate the descriptor for this standard, the teacher demonstrates knowledge, understanding and experience of high expectations and effective practice in meeting the needs of all learners, whatever their different needs.
And of course, differentiation is a tricky one. It's a kind of day-to-day one. It's worth noting it's not one of the yellow critical standards in the book. So it's not one that student teachers have to get to a decent level at pretty much straight away. It's one that they're going to need to work at and they're going to have to make some conscious effort to improve on. So at the moment, our fictitious student here that we're talking about has made very little progress, is really barely off the mark at all, is unaware. And the sort of language we're looking at in the table, in the Assessment Student Teachers book, it's words like limited or no impact, underdeveloped, not yet considered, superficial, just kind of not there at all. So that's where we're looking at.
So our starting point is obviously the evidence that the student has pulled together and has featured on their PLP, their Pebble Pad account. And we're looking to begin with at their plans. And what we're noticing here is that within the plans themselves, what have been uploaded or what have been completed on Pebble Pad is there's little or no information about the class in the top box on the plan. What we're noticing in this top box is that the information is quite tokenistic and quite generic. So we've got 2 pupils identified, one who is dyslexic and one who has poor behaviour.
And it's worth remembering that we slightly redesigned the lesson plan for the new Cardiff Partnership programmes. We've got this space at the top of a stream of lessons where student teachers can put all of the information that they get about the class that they teach. And often it can be, as a starting point, just all the stuff you get given, just all the data can be dumped into that box. And it can be kind of sorted out and refined later. But this student teacher hasn't really even cottoned on to the importance of getting hold of that basic data. I could almost imagine that maybe this information about Ryan and Jared is just something that maybe has been mentioned off the cuff by the mentor perhaps after a lesson. It's not that this student teacher has gone out and got hold of the class data and put it up at the top of the plan as a starting point. So that, that's not a great point to start with.
No. And crucially, what a student teacher should be doing once they've identified that important data in that top box is then using it, drawing upon it in the stream of lessons that follow. And what we notice when we look at this particular student teacher's individual plan is that they haven't even mentioned these 2 individual pupils, the dyslexic pupil and the one with poor behaviour, in their individual lesson plans. So there's no sense that this student teacher is trying to tailor their approaches, their strategies to particular pupils or indeed groups of learners. They have identified generally less able pupils with some quite underdeveloped and superficial comments about the strategies that might be used, but there's no evidence there of real deep thinking that's gone into this and a sense of confidence in differentiating for individuals and groups of learners.
And when we put this plan together, we've actually pointed out, I think for the first time on this new plan, the need to actually name the people that these strategies are for in the lessons. And even though it actually says on the plan to name them, this student teacher still hasn't done that. They've just got this kind of lump of less able pupils. We've got no evidence that this student knows who these people are. And yeah, the differentiation is kind of about outcome, isn't it? Oh, they probably won't complete all of the work today, and I might sit the weak ones next to the strong ones. As you say, it's really, really underdeveloped.
Absolutely. And I guess what we also notice when we move into the main body of the plan is that also there's no evidence of having differentiated questions, having considered where in the activities they might, again, extend some of those strategies that they've identified for less able pupils within the main body of the plan. So we can quite confidently say that this student is at the unaware stage in their planning. So moving on to the other evidence they've got within their assets relating to research and inquiry. As yet, this student hasn't engaged in any research and inquiry that's pertinent to this standard from what we can see. For example, there are no reflective log entries that have been made, and there are no observations included that speak to this particular standard. So that might give us a few clues actually as to why this particular student is struggling to differentiate in a purposeful and in a meaningful way.
And of course, they've got a lot more of this time on placement on the new programmes, this research and inquiry time. And it's likely that the mentor and the senior mentor of this student, as well as people at university, are going to be giving this student some very specific advice to go out and get their head around some of this stuff, go and speak to relevant members of staff and do observations. It's certainly going to be getting made clear to this student teacher that they're going to need to do some work to get off the ground with this standard.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of gives us an idea about next steps. But before we move on to next steps, we are noticing as well in the evidence related to lesson observations that are coming through in formal lesson observations and indeed in the formative comments logbook, the blue book. The student comments are relating to the student tending to treat the class as a single entity. They don't tend to spot or be able to help individuals who are struggling or bored. So again, reiterating this idea that they're unaware of the kind of indicators that might flag up particular issues concerning progress for pupils whilst this student teacher is teaching.
And we can see from this example, from the formative comments book, that the mentor has noticed that they don't know the individuals in the class, noticed that, this student teacher hasn't spotted that someone had done it and was bored, or that, a load of people were struggling. And quite understandably, the mentor's given this student some feedback, some formative feedback, saying use the plan to help the pupils get the most out of the time, use the differentiation strategies. So, it's all coming together now, and this is how it works when you're looking at a standard, that the evidence will start to paint a bit of a picture here, that the formative comments book is kind of agreeing with the very, very thin lesson planning, that this student teacher just isn't doing any of this stuff.
No. So pulling together all of these observations and all of the insights that we've made in relation to these various different streams of evidence, we're able to identify some next steps for this particular student in helping them to progress to the aware stage or indeed further. So this particular student, as we've hinted, needs to use the class data that's been provided as a starting point and put it in the top box of their lesson plans, which then cascades and is drawn upon later on in other plans in the sequence of lessons. They need to maybe observe some of these strategies with particular pupils, specifically the ones that have been named in the feedback, and perhaps be given some dedicated research and inquiry time, or use their dedicated research and inquiry time to have a look at some of these pupils whilst on a pupil trail and observe other teachers tailoring strategies for their particular learning needs, or indeed to meet with the ALNCO and have a deep discussion, maybe do some reflective log notes or a reflective log entry based on that encounter.
So thinking ahead now to hopefully seeing this student step up to the aware stage, all we're looking for at the aware stage is that things have been introduced. It's not necessarily happening all the time consistently, but it's increasingly taking place. They're kind of growing their effectiveness. They're not going to be independent of the mentor necessarily at the aware stage. They're just going to be kind of doing as they're told, I guess, which they're currently not doing at the unaware stage. It's worth kind of pointing out here that if a student is at the unaware stage, they are exactly what it says on the tin there, and some direction is going to be needed from the mentor or the senior mentor as to how they should go about sorting this problem out. They've got quite a lot of time, as we mentioned, to go and do these things, but at the stage that they're not aware, by definition, they don't necessarily know what they need to do or how they need to do it. So don't be afraid as a mentor or a senior mentor to actually prescribe some of these things to the student at this stage, because it's when they move from the aware stage to the capable stage that we're looking at them becoming increasingly independent.
Precisely. And I guess the final thing to say on that note is to ensure that prescriptions extend to specific reading and research and literature that they could engage with independently that might help to inform them and give them the confidence to apply some of the strategies and some of the research they've engaged with in practice.
And remember that the reflective models that the students have on the PLP scaffold this whole process for them. They're not just kind of having to write something freeform. There's a sort of multi-stage approach that they can take that weaves together reading and observing and thinking and reflecting and drawing conclusions in order to hopefully help them in moving from this unaware stage to this aware stage. So that's a student who is currently unaware in differentiation, and hopefully having looked at this, you're clear on not only why this is, but what it is we would do about it.
Hi there everybody, this is Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze from the Clinical Practice Workstream. We are going to be modelling discussions that might take place between students and mentors, students and senior mentors, tutors and mentors, and tutors and senior mentors during the quality assurance and progress reviews, all centring around assessing student teachers against the standards.
So what we've done here is taken one of the professional teaching standards, namely pedagogy number 2, differentiation, and we're going to kind of model the sort of professional dialogue that's likely to take place while we're trying to decide where in their stages of progress this particular fictitious student teacher is in this standard. Hopefully the principles that we outline here in this discussion will be fairly obviously transferable to other standards, or if you're thinking a bit more holistically, to groups of standards. A really good place to go to help you with this is the Assessment of Student Teachers Guide, which you can find on Moodle, in the Cardiff Partnership area of Moodle. And the most important thing to look at in there is the table of language, really, words and sort of short phrases that we think are indicative of somebody at the unaware, aware, capable or QTS plus stage, rather than having every kind of standard defined laboriously at each level. We've just given these lists of language, and so it would be a good idea to aim to use these little phrases and little words in your feedback written on learning and teaching observation forms, formative comment books, that kind of thing, because it just kind of helps to paint that picture.
And the final thing to say is that this model discussion is not intended to be subject or phase specific, so that all of our colleagues and student teachers can apply this guidance and model it within their own practice.
So the student teacher that we're talking about in this discussion, we think is at the aware stage for differentiation. And just a reminder, the differentiation standard says the teacher demonstrates knowledge, understanding and experience of high expectations and effective practice in meeting the needs of all learners, whatever their different needs. And so aware is that kind of middle stage between really not doing anything, not being aware, nothing's happening at all, through getting towards the capable stage, which is what somebody will look like when they're at the level to receive QTS. So they're somewhere between nowhere and ready to qualify. And obviously that's quite a wide range of kind of achievement. But the sort of things we're talking about here is that it's going on, it's not consistent, it's requiring support, it's increasingly getting there, but we're not looking at the finished article just yet.
Okay, so the first place that we look in terms of evidence to support our judgment that this student is actually aware in this standard is within their lesson planning on the PLP. And looking at the top box of this particular student teacher's lesson plans, it's clear that class data has been considered. It's present in the top box of the plan, but it looks to be fairly generic and has perhaps just been copied and pasted from Sims or from another spreadsheet that's been given to them by the mentor. There's no sense at this stage that the student teacher has been really kind of adding and augmenting that quite cold data with their knowledge and understanding of particular groups of learners or particular learners who have been named in this top box. That said, they've identified pupils and the strategies that are needed to support those pupils. So, for example, we've got Jack, who has English as an additional language. He's first language Polish, and there's a bit of guidance there about checking understanding and some information that he has an LSA for 10 hours. No sense of how that LSA is to be utilised as we go through into the main body of the plans, but certainly, good that they are aware that this particular pupil has needs that need to be catered to.
And one of the developments that we made to the lesson plan for the new programmes that started in 2019 is this idea of separating the kind of overarching class data, which is right there at the top of the plan, from the individual strategies which are relevant to a particular lesson. And if we move down to the first lesson on the plan, we can see that some of the information that the student teachers gained about the lesson has found its way down into the plan for something kind of reasonably specific about the lesson. Ryan and Hannah, they're named, there are strategies there for them, and they're kind of related to that data there. So we've got a bit of a start there in terms of individual differentiation strategies.
But what I guess we're seeing is a growing understanding of how to tailor those strategies to those pupils' needs, but not always secure evidence to suggest that the student teacher is matching differentiation strategies precisely where they should be utilised within the lesson and matching it to lesson content, etc. So we kind of colloquially term this as kind of scattergunning strategies because they've maybe seen them, observed them in the mentor's lesson, and they're hoping that they will work once applied to their own lessons. So some perhaps deeper thinking is required, and indeed assessment of the impact of those strategies via conversations with the mentor and evidence in the pupil work will help this student teacher move towards a more capable application of differentiation.
Yeah, it's often a feature of someone who's not quite there yet with their differentiation, that they'll kind of try to throw it all into the plan, strategies upon strategies, ones that they've seen other people use, as you say, ones that they've sort of copied, ones that they thought of perhaps when they're planning. But then you're not necessarily going to see them in the lesson. They've put them all in the plan. They feel very good about themselves. One of the ways that kind of helps get them away from that is the fact that we've got this column now that really asks the student teacher to say who, in terms of individuals or groups, these strategies are for. And this student teacher's not quite doing that all of the time. And I think that is the kind of alarm bell that rings when you can see there are strategies in there, but the student teacher's not really able to say who they're for. So they are still kind of scattergunning the strategies a little bit. And as we'll see later in the lesson feedback, not all of those were seen in the lesson.
So what this student teacher has done, which has perhaps supported them moving to the aware stage, is that they have engaged in some research and inquiry activity to support their understanding and indeed practice when it comes to differentiation. So the students got notes from their general session with the ALNCO. So they met with the ALNCO and there's evidence of the notes from that discussion in their PLP. There's a research and inquiry log entry which shows that they have growing understanding of the issues around differentiation, but we need to see this consistently embedded in their day-to-day practice for us to be able to say with confidence that they're capable at this particular standard.
And remember, this aware column in the assessment of student teachers uses words like growing and inconsistent. They're doing all these different things, the student teachers. They've got university input, they've got all this research and inquiry time. They might be reflecting very, very nicely in the PLP. But in order to get from the aware stage to the capable stage, we have to actually have them joining the dots. So they might be saying they want to do these things, but if we're not seeing it consistently and day to day and with increasing independence from mentors and senior mentors, then that student teacher is still at the aware stage.
And then we look to the evidence coming through in lesson observations, both formal and formative, in the formative comments logbook, the blue book. And what we can see coming through here is that although in the planning they've identified clear cases of pupils who need to be supported, what this student teacher doesn't seem to be aware of or able to do confidently is to identify those quiet strugglers, those quiet coasters, those pupils who could go underneath underneath the radar and who perhaps the student teacher is unable to pick up on at this particular stage in their development whilst they're in the middle of teaching, kind of in the moment, and adapt accordingly. The differentiation strategies that are outlined in the plan, they appear again to be more scattergun, and we can see that borne out in the lesson itself. So they don't seem to be precisely matching them to the needs of the learners as they progress towards the learning intentions.
And one of the things that student teachers are often given as feedback to improve or develop is questioning as an assessment for learning strategy, also as a kind of differentiation strategy in the lesson. And we can see here that the formative comments are saying that the student teacher's really been working hard on this. They've obviously been given it as feedback earlier on during their clinical practice. They're starting to take some strategies from the mentor, the use of lolly sticks to randomise the questioning, all that kind of thing. But that these things are not quite happening independently. They're not selecting things, independently with their critical faculties going. They're just kind of using them all the time. And also that they haven't quite got that confidence to come back at a poor quality answer to one of their questions. It happens a lot with inexperienced teachers that they'll take any answer off a pupil and say, oh, well done, yes, excellent, brilliant, great answer. And maybe it's not. And we can see that this mentor's giving this as feedback in the formative comments, that they need to not be afraid to differentiate with kind of on-the-ball questioning of the pupils, which obviously is a tricky thing to do and something that would take a lot of practice.
So it's clear that with this particular student, they've got a much greater awareness, a growing awareness of differentiation strategies. But in terms of next steps, they are going to need to be guided in how to assess the impact of those strategies and really understand whether they are helping to move pupils along and stretch and challenge them, or indeed scaffold and support them in their progress, or whether in fact they were kind of just scattergun and therefore ineffective. So whilst we would want them to continue to gain a bigger repertoire of strategies, what we really want them to be able to do is to know the impact of those strategies. So deep discussion with their mentors, so mentor meetings will be really important here, where the feedback can be reflected upon, where the evidence can be reflected upon for individual lessons that have been taught following those differentiation strategies. And to expect the student teacher to go for quality, not quantity in the plan. So once they've done that kind of deep reflection on the strategies and whether they worked, to encourage them to be more precise next time, to limit those strategies and to really focus on working on developing. Tom talked about questioning, really focus on developing their questioning technique in the moment when teaching as well. What they may need to do is to also observe really expert teachers utilising those strategies in practice, and perhaps write a reflective log entry based on that, triangulating their reflections with some reading that they've been encouraged to do, or perhaps at university or indeed by their subject or phase mentor, which can help them to understand why those particular strategies are ineffective when they've been utilising in practice, and perhaps what they need to do in order to increase impact going forward.
So that's a student teacher who's on the road to becoming capable, to becoming at the level that they need to gain QTS. Things are going on, they're not quite consistent, they're needing support from the mentor, they're not quite independent of the mentor yet, but hopefully if you have a student teacher like this, you can kind of see not only what the signs would be to identify them, but also what the next steps would be to move them up to the next level.
Hello, it's Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze here, again from the clinical practice workstream. And once again, we are modelling some conversations, professional dialogues that might take place centring on assessment of student teachers on clinical practice. These are the sorts of professional conversations that we hope will take place between students and mentors, students and senior mentors, mentors and university tutors, discussing the students' progress either in the run-up to or indeed the conducting of the progress reviews.
So what we're doing here is taking one of the professional teaching standards, namely pedagogy number 2, differentiation, and taking a dive into the sort of conversations that would take place when trying to come to a judgment about progress in this area. Hopefully what we say here will be easily applicable to other standards in the professional teaching standards, or if you're thinking a little bit more holistically, then you could apply this when considering groups of standards. The key thing to look for here is the Assessment of Student Teachers on Clinical Practice Guide, which is available in the Cardiff Partnership area of Moodle. In that book is a really helpful table of the sort of language you would be using when discussing students at particular levels. And that language is really handy for really crystallising your thinking about where people are. And therefore, it's good practice to try and use that language at every opportunity when giving written feedback in the formative comment books or on learning and teaching observation forms.
And the final thing to say is that this guidance is not intended to be phase or subject specific, but hopefully applicable across and to all of our student teachers on all of our programmes at Cardiff Met.
So the student teacher we're looking at here, student C, is at the capable stage. So if we take a look on the table, we can see the sort of language that we're talking about here when we're discussing a student at the capable stage. Notice the word mainly in brackets quite a lot of the time. We're not asking for kind of flawless performance, but what we are looking for is that things are becoming established and embedded, that they're having an impact, things are being done consistently, and that there's an increasing level of independence from the mentor.
And it's worth mentioning again that we are looking at the differentiation standard, and we're assessing the student teacher on their ability to demonstrate knowledge, understanding and experience of high expectations and effective practice in meeting the needs of all learners, whatever their different needs. So starting with the evidence in the student teacher's plans, what we can see here is that the student teacher is drawing upon generic whole school data for individual pupils, but they're also synthesising multiple sources of data, both subject specific and slightly more generic. But what they're doing as well is that the insights that they are making into the individual learners that they've come to know during the course of Clinical Practice 1 or 2 has started to add a much more complex picture of the pupils' needs in this particular class. What they've also done is they've also had the opportunity to assess, even if informally, pupils in this particular class, and they have also added into that top box any other useful insights based on pupil progress that are going to be useful to the remaining sequence of learning.
And this is a theme that's going to come up throughout this discussion, that in moving from the aware to the capable stage, a student teacher needs to make a significant investment of time into what they're doing. And so a really good list of class information and data that's going to be rich and relevant is not going to appear in the top of that lesson plan overnight. The student teacher is going to be adding things based on insights that they've got. They're going to be feeding in new kinds of data and information. They're going to understand that this information here is not static, even though it does sit over the top of a stream of lessons. And the result of having that understanding is that when we move down into individual lessons that we look at in the plans, we see consistently that the strategies for differentiation that the student teacher is choosing are well chosen for specific individual pupils and groups. It's clear that the student teacher really knows the individual pupils in this class and that they fully intend to challenge all of them. They're not just going to stretch the more able and talented, they're going to stretch the more able, they're going to stretch the ones in the middle, and that where they're putting support and scaffolding in place to help pupils, they're aiming to take it away progressively where appropriate, so that the pupil is not dependent on them for all time.
And I guess what we're noticing here as well is that whilst we're looking at P2 here, we're also getting a sense that this particular student teacher is starting to understand the links between assessing their pupils and then being able to tailor their differentiation accordingly. So the interconnectedness of standards is tacitly in evidence here in this student teacher's planning. They may, and we notice the jump from aware to capable here, have created new differentiation strategies that they have independently developed based on their increasing knowledge of the pupils. And they won't entirely be relying on strategies or approaches that have been given to them by the mentor. And this is borne out again also and triangulated by the judgments that the mentor makes later on. What they've also done consistently is they've been considering any TAs, any teaching assistants that have been assigned to their classes. And it's clear that the student has planned strategically for the input that the TA makes with the learners to which they've been assigned. They've also uploaded, and this is kind of crucial at this capable stage, if we think about the descriptor of capable as mainly impactful, this student teacher has also uploaded and tagged multiple evidence of pupil progress to demonstrate the impact of differentiation strategies employed. Of particular note is a before and after shot of a pupil's bookwork by a learner who was assigned a TA. So again, we've got that triangulation of the strategies employed and planned for in the plans, the feedback from the mentor, and then the evidence coming through in pupil work.
Let's move on to the evidence that the student teachers got in terms of research and inquiry. And we're going to continue the theme here that if we're going to be considered capable, we have to see a deep and rich seam of evidence from multiple sources. This is not a kind of one-hit problem-solved approach. And so what we should see in the student teachers' research and inquiry evidence is that they've looked at a wide range of sources that can help them understand differentiation. Here's an example of one of the research and inquiry log entries that the student has done, and we can see that they've got literature in here, Tom Sherrington's Rosenshine's Principles in Action, which is a very accessible piece of work, very current and topical, but a great piece of work to look at, full of good practical ideas. The student teacher has also gone further, realised that Sherrington's worth a look and that he's got a blog, and has started looking at some of his other writing on his blog to add extra information above and beyond what there is in the book. There are a huge number of things that the student could be looking at in terms of writing, not just high-level research findings from big journals, but practitioner texts, absolutely fine. Some texts about differentiation may be very generic, talking about it in the round. Some might be looking at differentiation really specifically to do with the subject that the student is teaching or the phase that they're at or what they're particularly looking at. They could be having conversations with experienced teachers. They could be collaborating with student teachers. They may have an assignment that they've done which includes some aspect of differentiation. But what we're looking for here is that there's multiple sources, there's a rich range of evidence, and that the student is taking a progressive, independent and cyclic approach to this reflection, in which they don't see the job as being done when they've reflected once, but that they continually feed in more and more information. They sit down and they do the thinking to make this new information impact on their practice, and they're becoming self-improving and increasingly independent.
Agreed. And it's really interesting to see in relation to that very specific example from this particular student's portfolio of evidence, the log, research and inquiry log entry, which mentions Sherrington's Rosenshine's Principles, where they're trying to get to understand an incident that took place in relation to a lesson pertaining to differentiation. So when we move to look at the evidence in the lesson, so coming through in the assessment of this student teacher, we notice that they did have an observation, an informal observation that was captured in the Blue Book, where some issues in the application of the almost sum approach to differentiating learning outcomes was having a negative impact on the engagement and on the progress of pupils in that particular lesson. And this student, being capable, picked up on that and saw that as an opportunity to take a deep dive into what happened using the Baines reflective model. You could argue one of the more challenging of the reflective models that we've got from our selection of 4, and using that to really try and understand, to problem solve, to reflect and develop their understanding of what happened in that particular lesson. We then see later on in future feedback that they receive that they have made adjustments to their practice. Tom mentioned earlier on this particular student's learning and teaching plans and the level of challenge that they're providing for all learners. So we can see that cyclic approach to progression and to developing their practice that Tom mentioned, coming through in that kind of joined up interconnectedness between the evidence that this student has tagged in relation to this standard.
So remember the words mainly impactful in the table of language when considering what actually goes on in lessons, because all of these other activities that the student teacher is doing, the research and inquiry activities, the planning, whatever it may be, we need to see impact on their teaching practice from these things, and we need to see a progressive evolutionary improvement in what the student teacher is doing. Another mention really of this theme, that moving from unaware to aware is a relatively small step, but moving from aware to capable is quite a long road in which the student teacher needs to prove themselves consistently over a period of time. So when the student teacher is actually teaching, we should see this progressive improvement. We should see the student teacher really knowing the pupils as individuals, understanding what they need, and having a wide variety of strategies available in their pocket so that they can meet those needs in the lesson. We should see them understanding as well that you have the more able and you have the less able who might be very visible and very obvious for whatever reason. But we also have these pupils who are able but not very visible, perhaps the ones that are happy to coast, and maybe the ones who are struggling but don't make a big deal of it, like to hide under the radar a little bit, and that the student has got strategies that mean that they actively spot and challenge these pupils, and that we can see this from the evidence. Again, this almost sum approach has clearly caused this student teacher a problem. It's caused them to stop and think, and hopefully what they've done in terms of the research and inquiry there means that they're really beginning to understand the enormous range of personalities that they have in the classroom in front of them.
And I just wanted to pick up on that point that you made, Tom, about this jump from aware to capable. And I think there's a wider implication for mentors, senior mentors and university tutors working with the student teacher to support them in being able to make those connections and join up their thinking, and perhaps even prescribe some research and inquiry activity, which might lead to some research and inquiry log entries that allow them to problem solve and elaborate on the reflective thought process that they're going through.
So what we should be seeing at this stage, don't forget, with a capable student is a student who's able to be signed off with qualified teacher status, who's able to become independent of the mentor and move away and start working on their own in their own classroom. So this student teacher is going to be able to adapt their planned strategies confidently in light of what actually happens in the lesson. They can change the plan on the fly because they're confident enough in what they're doing and what they know to do that. They would also be evolving over time in terms of their approach to the strategies. So they're not just going to keep using the same strategies with the same pupils. They're going to see the pupils as evolving and the strategies as changing as well. The aim is always to reduce that scaffolding, to reduce that support, and allow the pupils to fly free of the teacher in the same way as the student teacher is hoping eventually to fly free of the mentor. So we're seeing a cyclic approach by the student teacher in terms of seeking information and advice, devising the strategies, evolving what they're doing. The mentor needs to be confident that the student teacher would be able to do this by themselves with a full new set of classes in a new school, in a new context, before they can consider that that student teacher is capable and therefore worthy of receiving qualified teacher status.
So once we've established via the evidence that this particular student is capable, we then need to start to think about prescribing some targets to move them forward to QTS+. And this is again where the language of these key milestones in the student teacher's progression is really useful. So when we look to QTS+, we see words like firmly established, extensive, consistent, fully embedded, in-depth, high quality, and intuitive. So when we think about next steps in relation to P2 differentiation, we're looking at broadening the opportunities and experience of this student to Utilise this effective practice in differentiation with multiple classes, with multiple pupils, in multiple contexts, perhaps looking at slightly more challenging content. So when all of those variations are modified or are changed, can the student teacher still demonstrate that extensive, consistent practice in relation to differentiation? Also, there's an opportunity in relation to research and innovation. Could this student be signpost to consortia so that they could perhaps share some of their findings and the impact they've been having within the realms of differentiation on some kind of platform, for example, a consortia's publication or blog? Is there any way that they could be given the opportunity to share some of the progress that they've witnessed with their learners and facilitated with their department or on a broader school level, or to feed into the school's development plan, or indeed beyond to the wider kind of cluster of schools? It also might be an opportunity to get them to look and see if they could perhaps develop this in relation to their master's level work. If they haven't done assignment 1, perhaps, then maybe this is a focus for them. If they're thinking about going on to do more master's level credits, this might be the sort of thing that could lead on to a dissertation. And finally, where is the potential opportunity for them to extend their skills in the enrichment weeks if they're at that stage, or if indeed it is something that they have really taken hold of and can see being an aspect of their practice that they hone later on down the line?
So that's a student teacher who is at the capable stage, so their work is firmly embedded, consistent, and they're independent and self-improving. And just a taste there of the idea of QTS Plus as really being a door opening, really, and the student teacher being allowed to fly off and look beyond the context of the narrow walls of their classroom to maybe look at influencing the school or the wider community or fellow student teachers, for other people to be able to learn from them. The sky's the limit, really, with QTS Plus. Hopefully this has helped to focus your mind about where you might be or where your student teacher might be, and give some suggestions for how to move them even further on their journey. So we've looked at evidence and collecting evidence. We've looked at assessing ourselves against standards. So now it's time in the final part of this session to draw all of those threads together into the progress review.
Yeah, and this video is arguably the most important one, because it's in this video where we articulate to you the steps that you will take in preparing for your progress review, which is where you'll sit down with your mentor and effectively you'll be able to explain, based on your evidence, what your areas of strengths are, what your areas for development are, and how the evidence that you've pulled together supports those self-assessment judgments. And it's your mentor then who will be able to look at that evidence and listen to that kind of synthesis of your progress that you will have prepared for, that you will have put together, and they will either say, yes, I agree, or maybe some adjustments need to be made. So this video is really crucial. Hello everybody, it's Emma and Tom here again from the Clinical Practice Workstream, coming to you with a final video that is going to hopefully support you in preparation for and in completion of your progress review. So far we've given you some key headlines about the different types of evidence that you will pull together. We've hopefully demystified how your portfolio will look at each step along the continuum of effective practice, and we have given you a deep dive into one of the standards, P2 differentiation, to try and give you a clear idea of what your evidence will look like to support your progress from unaware all the way through at the moment to capable. So our final video is dedicated to helping you to prep for and to engage in the progress review. Step 1 is to ensure that you've got some really key documents and the progress review form to hand before you sit down to get ready for this progress review. So the first few steps that we're going to articulate to you now are your steps that you will take pre-progress review. So to begin with, you're going to need to make sure that you've got the progress review form, which is downloadable from the Moodle Cardiff Partnership site. You also need to make sure that you've got the Assessment of Student Teachers on Clinical Practice guide to hand, because there's some really important pages in that are going to assist you in self-grading and in having a look and scrutinising the evidence that you've got to help you come to informed judgments. So the key pages that you're going to want to have open and at the ready in that guide are pages 5 to 8, where you've got two tables. You've got table A, which is the table of professional standards for teaching and leadership, together with the QTS descriptors so that you know what you're aiming at. And table B, which is the continuum of effective practice descriptors. So you've got a lot of adjectives there that we've drawn upon in our previous videos that will help you, hopefully, to make informed judgments when you're self-assessing your progress towards the standards.
Now, the philosophy behind the new programme is about the student teacher having a different relationship with school colleagues than perhaps they used to in teacher education courses of the past. And the progress review is no exception. The idea here is not that you turn up to a meeting with your mentor and your mentor does a progress review to you, in which you're an entirely passive part of the process. You are supposed to be engaging in a professional dialogue with your mentor here, which is a much kind of more meaningful way of doing the progress review. But it does mean that you need to do a little bit of preparation. And beyond just getting hold of all the paperwork, as Emma says there, it's also important that you've got some idea as to where you are in relation to the standards. So you're going to need to gather some evidence of that. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that for the first progress review, you're very early on in the course and you shouldn't expect of yourself to have a huge and extensive evidence library. If you look at the threshold for CAP 1, we're really only interested particularly in the critical yellow standards. So if you're sitting feeling that you've got a mountain to climb to gather a pile of evidence, don't feel that way. You need to prioritise the things that really matter, which are those all-important yellow standards that are sort of bread and butter things that you should by now be doing in some way, shape or form every day on the course.
So the important thing to remember is at this stage, you've actually got quite a lot of evidence that has been accumulating if you've been engaging with the PLP up to this point within your asset store. So every time you complete a lesson plan, it automatically tags as lesson plan and it'll be in your asset store. Every time you've done some research and inquiry, the same thing will happen. So you've already probably got a fairly sizable asset store at present, but there will be a number of bits and bobs of evidence that are important to your self-grading in preparation for the progress review and tagging things to the standards that you perhaps may not have already uploaded to your asset store. These things will encompass formative comments logbook pages. Now, we talked about that in an earlier advisory video. You will want to take pictures of your formative comments logbook if you feel that comments that have been made by a mentor are relevant to particular standards. So you can easily do this if you've got the Pebble Pocket app, take pictures and upload relevant pages from the formative comments logbook to your asset store. You might also have some really good examples of pupils' work and or resources that you've made in preparation for particular lessons. Let's say, for example, you've created some differentiated resources that will be useful to the P2 standard. So those bits and bobs of evidence in preparation for your progress review, I think it'll be important for you to do some quick reconnaissance, take some pictures and upload them to your asset store. So you've got everything at your fingertips then ready to approach the next steps. The other bits of evidence that you might have that will be very much dependent on your individual experience to date before the programme is you might have in a previous career perhaps been a teaching assistant and done some relevant professional learning that you might want to also put up in your asset store. So if you've got anything that kind of fits that criterion, then by all means upload it to your asset store so you've got that ready as well in preparation for the next step. So what you'll have then is a range of evidence that will probably fall into those 3 juicy titles that we outlined in the first video. You'll have evidence of practice, you'll have evidence of assessment, and evidence of research and inquiry. So this will have you all teed up now with a very full asset store ready for the next step, which is tagging evidence to standards and self-assessing.
And at this point, you'll definitely want your assessment of student teachers guide in front of you, because the tags that we're using to tag to the standards are those codes which you can find in the table of standards. They start with P1, P2, P3, and so on. We've got some L's, we've got some C's, and so on. So those little codes are the shorthand that you need when you're tagging against the standards. And this is the point where you get to self-assess your own progress. Open up the progress review form that you've downloaded from Moodle. It's a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, but it looks a bit like a form, and you'll see that it's got 2 columns with the list of standards. And the left-hand column for student teacher is where you get to colour code yourself as unaware, aware, capable, or QTS plus in each one of the standards. And you'll need, as you go down this column, to simultaneously assess where you think you are and grab hold of the evidence that you feel backs up your point and tag it to that particular standard that you're considering at the time, so that further down the line when you're talking to the mentor, you'll be able to find this stuff again really, really quickly. So it's a simple process of tagging with, for example, P1, P2, P3. Don't forget that you can tag a piece of evidence to more than one standard at a time if it's relevant.
And really, the thing to bear in mind if you're unsure as to what to grade yourself as is those previous videos that we showed you in relation to one standard, in relation to P2. So if you're unsure as to whether you're unaware, aware, capable or QTS plus, then go back to those advisory videos and view your evidence with that in mind. Remember to use those descriptors that are in Table B in the Assessment of Student Teachers on Clinical Practice Guide. So it'll be that simultaneous process of checking your evidence, checking the descriptors, checking the descriptor of the QTS standards, and then making a really informed self-assessment judgment in order to self-grade in preparation for the progress review itself. So a really good rule of thumb at this stage, and indeed at every stage when you're preparing for a progress review, is to choose the best evidence that meets the descriptor for that standard and that matches the words in the progress continuum table. Tag wisely. If you've got nothing much for that standard, then consider tagging yourself as unaware. It's fine to be unaware early on in the course. And then you can use the search function when you think that you've got everything sorted for a particular standard. Search for that particular standard, and then underneath you will have it populating with that best evidence that reflects your progress at that stage.
It's probably worth having a little word about this search function at this point with an eye on the rest of the course, because when you click on the relevant standard in that menu over on the right of the PLP, all that's doing is searching for anything in your PLP that you have tagged with P1, P2 or whatever it might be. It's a really helpful function for bringing up things that are relevant to you at the time, but only if you put some ongoing effort in to cultivating your evidence library so that what comes up is recent and relevant and high quality. So some quick hints and tips on that front. First of all, don't tag absolutely everything with anything that might be relevant. Make sure that if you tag a P1 or a P2 or an L1, it really is a high quality, good example, and not just that you think there was a tiny bit of it going on there. Also, it's going to be the case that something that you tag as evidence of you being good at something at the moment might not be so relevant in a few months' time. You'll have far better quality evidence for that particular standard. And so you're going to need to tag things, but you're also going to need to untag things occasionally. So if you do use the search function, you bring something up, you see something and think, actually, that's really old now. I don't really need that anymore. That's the time to untag it, because otherwise, as you get towards the end of the course, you'll have become a little bit of a standards evidence hoarder, and you'll click P1 P1 or P2, and up will come maybe 20 or 30 things, which isn't really going to help you when you're looking for the best thing. So make sure that you're doing a bit of pruning and a bit of cultivating of that evidence library on an ongoing basis throughout the course.
I think that's really good advice. And likewise, if you have tagged a specific piece of evidence to a standard and it's not entirely obvious that, which part of that bit of evidence is relevant to this standard, then you will either need to articulate that during the progress review itself. So a good example of this might be a stream of lessons where obviously you've got a lot of content, but it's maybe a particular lesson that is relevant to a specific standard. You can either, make some notes yourself so that you can articulate that to your mentor during the progress review, or indeed you could use the comment function to the right-hand side of the stream of lessons and just put a little comment in there that, for example, P7, please see lesson 3 in this sequence.
So at this point, let's just take stock. You will have self-assessed yourself using the colour codes against every one of the professional standards, and you'll have made sure that at the touch of a button on your PLP, you can bring up relevant pieces of information supporting your ideas about where you are. Now it's time to go into your PLP to open up your synthesis of progress table and to crystallise and synthesise all of that information into more of a holistic statement of your areas of strength and areas for development in each area of the standards. Now, if you continue your teaching career in Wales, this is going to become something that you use during your NQT as well, because this table in its final form will follow you into your teaching career. So you need to get used to it. You don't have to write about every single standard when you're synthesizing your progress in this table. You've already isolated every standard individually when you were self-assessing and color coding. This is the point where you really come to some conclusions about your areas of strength and areas for development, and you expand upon your thoughts and your points by writing fairly briefly and concisely what you think about your progress in this table, and this table will help to form the starting point for the professional dialogue that you're about to hold with your mentor.
Absolutely. And a note on your areas for development. When you're thinking about those areas for development, you might at an early stage in your first progress review see that you've got quite a lot of red, so it might be quite difficult to discern which standards are going to be most important or which areas of the standards are going to be most important to target for your next progress review. Well, it's a really good idea then to flip to page 11 of the Assessment of Student Teachers on Clinical Practice guide, where you'll find the next key assessment point threshold. So it'll be good to have a look at where you're supposed to be for your next progress review, which will then give you an indication of where your areas for development are going to need to be focused in preparation for that next progress review. So if you're floundering, have a look at that next key assessment point threshold, and that will give you some clues.
So you've finished all your prep now and you're ready for that progress review meeting, which you will have arranged with your mentor. Now, depending on the mentor's ways of working, they may wish to have information in advance of the meeting. And if you've completed your self-assessment and your synthesis of progress, it's polite and it's professional to let your mentor know that the information is ready there. You might need to email them the form, but they can hopefully view your synthesis of progress in the PLP. They may wish to do some prep before the meeting and see where you're at, so that the meeting goes a little bit quicker. Mentors are busy people though, and they may just look at it once you sit down in the meeting. Don't forget that we accommodate our mentors' ways of working because they're all different, so just be kind of on the ball and professional with that. But you're in the driving seat here. The mentor's going to be making the final decision, but instead of just sitting there passively and waiting for them to assess you, you are the one who's going to present your self-assessment of where you feel you are, your reasons why, your evidence to back you up, and the mentor is going to make their way through the standards, discussing with you what they see as your strengths and areas for development. As part of that conversation, it may be that you end up clarifying your judgments against one or two of the standards. The second column on the progress review form allows the mentor to put either a matching or a different colour code for each standard area there. But as part of that process, you should have a discussion in which you give your reasons for what you think it is. The mentor gives their reasons for what they think it is. In the end, your mentor's decision is going to be final. Your mentor's more experienced in the profession, but you are going to provide them with all the information that you can to explain your judgment, because don't forget, not everything that happens on the program happens in front of your mentor.
Really good advice. And I guess on a practical note, it's going to be very important that you, by this stage, have shared your PLP with your mentor. And it would also be good practice to have your PLP open on a laptop or on a device or on a desktop at the ready simultaneously whilst you're going through your progress review. That way you can be quite agile in response to your mentor's advice and the final grading that you come to, because what you will then be able to do, based on the conversations that you've had with your mentor and their perspective on your areas for development and your strengths, is we're asking you to then tweak your synthesis of progress so that your strengths and areas for development reflect the final progress review outcome, so that you know exactly where you are and where you're going to next. Because what we don't want is that you've got areas for development according to your perspective that through the process of the progress review have somewhat changed. We want you to then go back in, make them crystal clear so that you are moving forward with an informed idea about what your next steps are. So now that you've watched those 5 videos, hopefully you feel in a more informed position about how you're going to use the PLP to demonstrate that you're making progress and to demonstrate that you're having an impact on the pupils that you work with and the communities that you serve.
Just a reminder that if you have technical problems with your PLP, or if any of your school colleagues have technical problems, you need to contact the EWC directly, because they have all the admin rights and the ability to sort those problems out. A reminder that we deliberately don't give you a checklist of things that we want. It's not a tick box process, your PLP, because it's never finished. If you stay in Wales in particular, it will follow you into the profession. So we're not looking at something that you tick off and finish. The way that you're going to make the PLP work for you is not to keep it to yourself, but to use it as the basis of those all-important professional conversations that you have with your peers here on the programme and with your school and university colleagues.